I thought the worst thing about getting old was watching the world change without you. I was wrong. The worst thing was pressing play on a voice message from my granddaughter and realizing it might be the last time I ever heard her say, "Grandpa." She was 7 days underground, trapped in her in-laws' storm cellar, whispering into a dying phone, telling me they only had water left. And while she spoke with the innocence of a child, I could hear the adults around her making choices that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through a moment where love and helplessness collided, where all you could do was listen and pray, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. Your support keeps stories like this alive. I was at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed, the same old oak table my wife and I had eaten at for nearly 40 years. She'd been gone 3 winters by then, but I still set her mug out of habit, still filled it with tea I never drank. The rain had been falling for days, the kind of rain that doesn't feel dramatic at first, just persistent, like it's wearing the world down grain by grain. The news had been talking about floods in the southern counties, roads washed out, cell towers down. I knew my granddaughter was visiting her husband's family in one of those towns, but they'd assured me they were safe. Storm cellar, they said, built by the grandfather himself, solid. I trusted that word cellar because in my generation it meant preparation, survival, foresight. I trusted family, too, which turned out to be my first mistake. The notification on my phone wasn't a call, it was a voice message from an unknown number at first glance, but when I tapped it, her name appeared. My hand started shaking before I even pressed play. There's a kind of fear that announces itself ahead of time, like your body knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I pressed play. "Grandpa, it's me." Her voice was so small, so careful, like she was afraid of being heard by someone other than me. "Mommy says I should talk quiet. It's dark here. We're in the cellar. Day 7. We only have water now." She paused, and I could hear something in the background, a low, constant sound. Water, moving somewhere it shouldn't. "The phone is almost sleepy. I love you." That was it. 32 seconds. The message ended with a soft click, like she'd set the phone down gently, the way she used to set my glasses on the table when she was little, afraid of breaking something fragile. I sat there for a long time with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to nothing, hoping somehow her breathing would come back through the speaker. I called her immediately, straight to voicemail. I called again and again. Then I called my daughter. Nothing. Her husband? Nothing. His parents? Nothing. The silence was louder than any alarm I'd ever heard. I tried to reason with myself. Cell towers were down. Power was out. This didn't mean the worst. It didn't mean goodbye. But my chest felt tight in a way memory alone couldn't explain, because I'd heard something else in her voice, something she didn't have words for yet, not just fear, but awareness, the kind that comes when children realize the adults don't have all the answers anymore. I stood up and went to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle where I lived, but the sky was still swollen and gray. I thought about that cellar, about concrete walls and a single set of stairs leading up to a door that might already be underwater. I imagined them counting days instead of hours, marking time by hunger and thirst. Day 7. I did the math without wanting to. Most people can survive weeks without food. Water, as long as it stays clean, can keep you alive. But water rising is different. Water rising doesn't care about patience. I replayed the message. This time I noticed more. The way she said, "Mommy says," not "Mommy told me." Present tense. Her mother was still there, still trying to manage fear by turning it into rules. Talk quiet, save battery, be good. I heard another sound too, faint but unmistakable. Someone crying, an adult trying not to, and under it all, the water. A slow slosh, like waves in a bathtub, except there was no drain. I thought about the last time I'd seen her, just a month earlier. She'd been running through my yard, chasing fireflies, laughing so hard she forgot to breathe. I'd climbed into my lap afterwards and asked me if I was afraid of dying. Children ask questions like that, sudden and sincere. I told her the truth as gently as I could. I said I wasn't afraid of dying someday, but I was afraid of not loving people enough while I was alive. She nodded like she understood something important, then asked if we could have ice cream. Now she was underground, rationing water, whispering love into a phone that was almost sleepy. I felt useless in a way I hadn't felt since my wife died in that hospital room where the machines kept beeping long after her eyes had closed. Back then, at least I could hold her hand. Now, I couldn't even reach through the airwaves. I did what old men do when they don't know what else to do. I made coffee, even though it was almost evening. I sat back down and started making calls again, this time to people who might know people. County emergency lines were overwhelmed. I was put on hold more times than I can count, listening to recorded assurances that help was coming. I wanted to scream at the voice, tell it that help was already late, day 7 late. While I waited, I wrote down everything my granddaughter had said, word for word, on a yellow legal pad. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid the phone would die and take her voice with it. Maybe I needed to feel like I was doing something concrete. Day 7. I underlined it. Just water. I circled that. Then I wrote the word cellar and drew a little box around it, as if I could trap the danger inside ink. My phone buzzed again, and my heart jumped so hard it hurt. Another voice message, this one shorter. Her voice was even quieter. "Grandpa, Mommy says to tell you we're okay. Daddy's parents are here too. The water is higher. We have to stand sometimes. My feet are tired, but I'm being brave like you said." There was a pause, longer this time. "If you can hear this, don't be sad." I broke then, right there at that table, with my wife's mug still untouched. I put my head down and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, because bravery shouldn't be something a child needs in a dark cellar. And telling someone not to be sad feels a lot like saying goodbye, even if you don't know it yet. I wiped my face and straightened up. If there was one thing I'd learned in a long life, it was that despair wastes time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. I didn't know yet that those voice messages were only the beginning, that what I would learn about the choices being made in that cellar would change how I saw family forever. All I knew in that moment was this: my granddaughter had reached out to me across water and darkness, and as long as she was still talking, I had to keep listening and fighting and believing that love could travel farther than floodwaters. I barely slept that night, if you can call it sleep, when your eyes are closed but your mind keeps replaying the same 30 seconds of sound over and over. Every time I drifted off, I heard her say day 7 again, like a calendar tearing itself apart. At dawn, I was already dressed, sitting in my truck with the engine running, staring at the map on my phone. The town where they were trapped was 3 hours away on a good day. Now half the roads were marked in red, closed or impassable, bridges gone, detours looping back on themselves. I didn't care. I told myself that even if I couldn't reach them, I needed to be closer, like proximity alone might strengthen the signal between us. As I drove, the landscape changed from damp fields to drowned ones. Crops lay flat under muddy water, fences half submerged like ribs sticking out of a body. I passed abandoned cars pulled over at odd angles, doors left open as if people had simply stepped out and vanished. The radio crackled with emergency updates, names of towns, numbers of missing, reassurances that sounded thinner each time they were repeated. I kept the phone on the passenger seat, screen lit, waiting for it to buzz again. It didn't, not for hours. By the time I reached the last open checkpoint, a tired-looking sheriff waved me down and told me there was no point going farther. "They're evacuating by boat when they can," he said, eyes flicking to the rising water behind him. "If they haven't come out yet, they're sheltering." Shelter, another word that used to mean safety. I wanted to tell him about the voice messages, about day 7 and standing water and a phone almost sleepy. But there were a dozen people behind me with their own stories, their own reasons for needing to pass. I pulled over instead and parked on a stretch of higher ground with a view of nothing but gray. That's when the third message came through. I didn't even hit play right away. I watched the waveform bounce on the screen, proof that sound had been captured, that breath still existed somewhere beneath the earth. When I finally listened, her voice was hoarser, like she'd been whispering too long. "Grandpa, it's dark, dark now. The light stopped working. Mommy says it's okay. Grandma, his grandma, she says we should save the phone for later, but Mommy let me send this." There was a rustling sound and then a sharp whisper from an adult, cut off mid-word. "The water is cold. Daddy says we'll take turns sitting on the shelf. I don't like when they argue. I love you." That last line hit me harder than anything else. I don't like when they argue. In a cellar filling with water, adults were still finding reasons to fight over space, over resources, over who was right, over what should be done next. I pictured it too clearly. Concrete walls sweating moisture, shelves lined with canned food now gone or floating, adults standing knee-deep in water, voices low but edged with panic. And in the middle of it, my granddaughter, absorbing every word, every tone, learning lessons she shouldn't have to learn yet about fear and selfishness and the thin line between leadership and control. I called again, even though I knew it wouldn't go through. This time I left a voicemail. I spoke slowly, carefully, like she was sitting right in front of me. I told her I loved her, I told her she was brave, but that it was okay to be scared too. I told her to keep listening to her mom, to save her energy, to imagine the sun waiting for her. I didn't tell her I was terrified. I didn't tell her that the map on my phone looked more hopeless by the hour. Hours later, as the sky began to darken again, another message arrived, and this one wasn't from her. It was her mother. Her voice was strained, stripped of the politeness she'd always wrapped herself in. "Dad," she said, and hearing her call me that instead of Grandpa told me everything about how thin things had become. "The water's at our thighs now. We moved the kids onto the shelves, but there's not much room. His parents think we should break through the door and try to swim out. I think it's suicide. We can hear boats sometimes, but they don't stop. If If you can reach anyone, anyone at all. Her voice broke and the message ended abruptly, like she'd been interrupted or the phone had finally given up. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, feeling the weight of a decision that wasn't even mine to make. Do you stay where you are and hope help finds you, or do you risk everything on a desperate escape? It's easy to talk about bravery when you're dry and safe. It's different when the water is cold and rising and your child is watching your every move. I made calls until my voice went hoarse. State emergency offices, national hotlines. I gave addresses, landmarks, descriptions of the cellar as best I could remember from a visit years ago. Some promised to pass the information along. Some said they were already stretched beyond their capacity. One young woman on the line went quiet when I mentioned children, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "We'll try." Try felt like a fragile thing to hang a life on, but it was all I had. Night fell, and with it came the longest silence yet. No messages, no missed calls, just the hum of insects and the distant sound of water moving where it shouldn't. I thought about my granddaughter standing on a shelf, feet numb, listening to adults argue about doors and darkness. I thought about the choices being made without me, choices I might not agree with but couldn't change. And for the first time, a terrible thought crept in. What if the last thing she ever did was tell me not to be sad? I don't know how long I sat there before the phone buzzed again. When it did, I almost dropped it. It was her voice, faint but steady. "Grandpa, Mommy says we have to try something soon. The water is at her waist. She told me to remember your face and your laugh. I can hear thunder again. If I don't get to talk to you anymore, thank you for loving me first." That's when I realized this story was no longer just about survival. It was about what people choose to give their children when there's nothing left to give but words and example. And whatever happened next, I would have to live with knowing what those choices were. When that last message ended, I didn't move. I didn't breathe right away either. I just sat there in the dark cab of my truck, holding the phone like it might still be warm from her hands. Thank you for loving me first. That wasn't something a child says unless she's been coached for goodbye, unless an adult has looked into her eyes and decided honesty matters more than comfort. I felt anger rise up in me then, sharp and unfamiliar, aimed at people I barely knew, but suddenly had opinions about. Because loving a child first also means protecting them from needing farewell speeches. The thunder she mentioned rolled in not long after, distant at first, then closer, shaking the air. Rain started again, heavier this time, pounding the windshield so hard I had to turn the radio up just to hear myself think. The announcer's voice was grim now, talking about flash flooding on top of already saturated ground. I imagined that cellar filling faster, water climbing from waist to chest, shelves becoming islands that shrank by the minute. I imagined arguments turning into shouts, then into silence as people realized shouting wasted oxygen and energy they didn't have. I called emergency again and again, refusing to hang up when put on hold. When I finally got through to someone who sounded like they'd been awake for days, I told him everything. The messages, the children, the cellar. I told him the exact words my granddaughter had used because somehow that felt important, like precision might save her. There was a pause on the line, and then the operator said something I hadn't expected. "Sir," she said quietly, "we have a volunteer boat crew in that area that's been rerouted twice. I can flag this location as priority because of minors." Priority, another word that felt thin, but it was better than nothing. I waited. That's the part people don't talk about when they tell survival stories. The waiting, the way every minute stretches until it feels personal, like time itself is testing your resolve. I replayed old memories to keep my mind from inventing new horrors. Her first steps across my living room carpet, the way she used to fall asleep in the back seat, mouth open, clutching a stuffed rabbit, missing one ear. I told myself stories where boats arrived just in time, where cellars held a little longer, where miracles happened because people believed in them hard enough. Another message came through near midnight. This one was chaotic, voices overlapping. Her mother's voice was louder now, urgent. "Dad, they're opening the door. I tried to stop 'em. The water outside is moving fast. I think—" There was a crash, a rush of sound so loud it hurt my ears, like a wave breaking directly into the microphone. My granddaughter screamed once, a short, sharp sound, and then the line went dead. I shouted into the phone like it could hear me. I called back until my finger cramped, until the screen finally dimmed and went black to save its own life. That was the moment I truly understood helplessness. Not the quiet kind that settles in over years, but the violent kind that arrives all at once and knocks the breath out of you. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel and then immediately regretted it because pain felt wrong when it was theirs that mattered. The rain eased some time before dawn. The sky lightened from black to gray, and with it came a strange, fragile hope. Storms end, water recedes, people survive impossible things every day. I clung to those truths like handholds on a cliff. When my phone finally buzzed again, the sound startled me so badly I laughed and cried at the same time. It wasn't her. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code matched. I answered on the first ring. A man's voice came through, breathless, shouting over engine noise. "Is this the grandfather?" he asked. "We got your messages forwarded. We found the house." I couldn't speak at first. He kept talking, filling the silence with details. The water had rushed in when the door gave way, knocked two adults off their feet. One of them had managed to wedge the door partially closed again with a shelf, buying time. They'd climbed higher, pressed themselves against the ceiling beams, passing the kids up first. The boat crew had heard banging and screams, faint but persistent. They'd followed the sound. "They're alive," he said finally, and that word landed in me like a physical thing, heavy and bright. Alive. He cautioned that they were hypothermic, exhausted, that one of the grandparents had swallowed a lot of water, but the kids were okay. My granddaughter was okay. I sank back against the seat and let out a sound I didn't recognize as my own. Relief isn't a clean emotion. It comes tangled with everything that came before it. Fear doesn't vanish just because danger passes. It leaves an echo. I thanked the man until he told me I didn't have to anymore. Before he hung up, he added something softer. "Your granddaughter kept asking if her grandpa knew she was brave," he said. I told her yes. They let me talk to her later that day from a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and damp clothes. Her voice was weak but steady. "Grandpa," she said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, "we're out. The sun was really bright. Mommy cried a lot." She paused. "I'm still tired, but I'm not scared now." After the call ended, I sat with everything I'd learned about family that argues under pressure, about adults who make the wrong choice for reasons that feel right in the moment, about children who watch and remember. I didn't blame anyone outright. Fear scrambles judgment. Love makes people desperate. But I did understand something clearly for the first time. Preparation isn't just about cellar turns and supplies. It's about humility, about listening, about choosing calm over pride when lives depend on it. My granddaughter survived because enough people chose to keep trying, because she used her voice when silence would have been easier, because love, sent in shaky messages from underground, traveled farther than anyone expected, and because sometimes miracles don't look like lightning from the sky. Sometimes they sound like a child whispering, "Grandpa," into a phone that's almost sleepy, and being heard just in time. In the days after they were rescued, everything moved at a strange, uneven pace. Some moments rushed by in a blur of phone calls, updates, and logistics. Others stretched out endlessly, heavy with thought. I drove home instead of staying near the hospital because I knew myself well enough to understand that if I stood at her bedside too soon, I'd crumble in front of her, and she didn't need that weight. She needed steadiness. Children always do, even after they've seen too much. When I finally visited, 3 days later, she was sitting up in the bed with socks that were too big and a coloring book someone had donated. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of a monitor. When she saw me, her face lit up in a way that felt like sunlight after a long winter. She didn't cry. She just held her arms out and said, "You came," as if there had never been any doubt. I hugged her carefully, aware of IV lines and bruises I didn't want to ask about yet. She smelled like soap and plastic and something faintly metallic, but underneath it all, she still smelled like my granddaughter. Her mother stood by the window, looking older than she had a week earlier. When our eyes met, there was a complicated exchange there, an apology tangled with gratitude and exhaustion. We didn't talk about the cellar that day. We talked about the weather clearing, about how she'd lost one shoe somewhere in the flood, about the nurse who kept sneaking her extra apple juice. Trauma doesn't like to be confronted head-on, especially by children. It circles back later when you least expect it. It came back for me first, late one night, when the house was quiet again. I replayed the messages, all of them, saved in a folder I didn't have the heart to delete. Listening now, knowing the ending, didn't make them easier. In some ways, it made them harder, because now I could hear the moments where things might have gone differently. The hesitation in her mother's voice, the tension in the background, the subtle shift from waiting to acting out of panic. Survival stories often get flattened into neat arcs after the fact, but living them is messy, full of near misses and choices that could have tipped the balance either way. A week after the rescue, her in-laws came to see me. They stood on my porch like people bracing for judgment. The older woman's hands shook as she spoke. She told me how the cellar had been built decades ago, how it had never flooded before, how they'd believed in it too much, believed it was invincible. Her husband stared at the floor when she described forcing the door, convinced that escape was the only option left. I thought staying was killing us. I didn't think opening it would almost do the same. I listened. That was the hardest part. Because anger would have been easier. Anger gives you a place to put pain, but what I saw in front of me were two people who would relive that decision for the rest of their lives, no matter how the story ended. I told them the truth, gently but firmly. I told them that preparation without flexibility can become a trap, that listening to dissent, especially from a parent protecting a child, isn't weakness, it's wisdom. They cried then, quietly, and I let them. My granddaughter went home after 2 weeks. The town she returned to was changed. Houses gutted, streets layered in mud, familiar landmarks gone. She asked questions adults weren't ready to answer. Why didn't the boats come sooner? Why did the water keep rising? Why were people yelling at each other if they loved each other? I answered what I could in ways a child could carry. I told her that fear makes people forget how to be kind sometimes, but that kindness can be remembered again. I told her her voice mattered, that calling me had been the bravest thing she could have done. One afternoon, months later, she brought me a drawing. It showed a dark box with stick figures inside, and above it, a big yellow circle. She said, "That's the cellar," tapping the box, "and that's the sun when we came out." She'd drawn a little rectangle with lines coming out of it, too. She added, "That's my phone. It saved us." I corrected her gently. I told her the phone helped, but what really saved them was people listening, people refusing to give up, and her courage in speaking even when she was scared. She nodded, thoughtful, like she was filing that away for later. Children do that. They carry lessons quietly until they're needed. As for me, I changed some things. I stopped putting off hard conversations. I updated my own emergency plans and talked them through with my family instead of assuming everyone knew what to do. I learned that being the calm voice on the other end of the line can matter as much as being the strong arms pulling someone from the water. And I learned that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, again and again, until someone hears it. I still have those messages. I don't listen to them often, but when I do, I don't just hear fear anymore. I hear connection. I hear proof that even in a dark cellar, with water rising and hope thinning, a child trusted that her voice could reach someone who loved her, and it did. That knowledge doesn't erase the terror of those days, but it gives them meaning. It reminds me that survival isn't just about making it out alive. It's about what we carry forward, what we learn, and how we choose to love after the floodwaters recede. The weeks after the flood settled into a strange rhythm. Life was moving again, but everything had a tremor underneath it, a reminder that the world could change overnight. I found myself checking the weather obsessively, not out of paranoia, but out of gratitude for dry roads and clear skies. My granddaughter asked about the storm constantly, each question a tiny thread pulling the memory forward. "Grandpa," she said one morning as I poured her cereal, "why did the water get so high?" I hesitated, because the truth is messy, but she needed honesty. "Sometimes," I said, "water doesn't care about walls or doors. It just comes. People have to make choices when that happens, sometimes good ones, sometimes mistakes." She frowned, trying to understand, then shrugged, already moving on to another question about her cat. Children live in the moment, even after the worst. Her parents came over one afternoon, tired and tense. The air was thick with things unsaid, guilt still simmering underneath polite smiles. They'd been through so much, but they were also still human, still learning, still flawed. Her mother told me quietly that she thought about the cellar every night, replaying decisions and arguments, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. I told her what I'd said the first time, that survival is rarely perfect, that courage and love matter as much as logic in moments like those. But even adults need to hear it repeated. She nodded, eyes red, and let herself exhale a little. One evening, my granddaughter came to me holding a notebook. She had been writing since the rescue, scribbling down memories in her shaky handwriting. "Grandpa, I'm keeping track of what happened," she said seriously, tapping the cover. I peeked inside. There were drawings of the cellar, little faces pressed against walls, lines representing the water, and speech bubbles with everything she remembered. I realized she had already started processing trauma in a way I hadn't expected. Children are resilient in ways adults rarely anticipate, but they also carry shadows quietly, and I knew I had to be careful not to let those shadows take root. I started reading through her notebook each night, sitting in my favorite armchair with the lamp turned low. Her words brought back every sound of that terrifying week, the drip of water, the hush of her whispers, the panicked breaths of adults trying to make sense of the rising tide. And yet, her writing also revealed hope, small triumphs, humor she remembered, the way her mother had tripped over a shelf, the way she and the other children had made a game of counting raindrops. She didn't write just about fear. She wrote about the way they had survived it and the way they had stayed human through it. It was in those evenings reading her notebook that I began to understand the depth of what she had learned and what we all had. Children watch more than we think. They record moments we might dismiss, lessons we assume are too subtle. Her voice messages, the ones that had shredded my calm, had been more than pleas for help. They were teaching moments for me, too. They reminded me that even when adults argue or panic, a child's courage can anchor hope. That hope, once anchored, can ripple out further than we imagine. Months passed. The town began to recover slowly. Roads were repaired, bridges rebuilt, homes patched together. Some families never returned. Some stayed but carried permanent scars, both visible and invisible. My granddaughter's parents decided to move temporarily to a higher part of town to give her a chance to play outside without fear, to allow their own hearts to rest a little. I visited as often as I could, filling my truck with coloring books, small toys, and packets of cookies she loved. Each visit she ran to me without hesitation, throwing herself into my arms as though no time had passed, as though fear could be left behind in the past where it belonged. One evening, after a long day of rebuilding efforts, I found her sitting quietly on the porch swing, notebook in hand. She looked up at me, eyes bright but reflective. "Grandpa," she said softly, "I wrote something new." I sat beside her, and she read aloud, her voice steady now, strong and deliberate. "Grandpa, I was scared, I was thirsty, I was cold, but I was brave, and Grandpa loved me first. That made everything else okay." She closed her notebook and leaned against me. "Even if it's scary again, I can remember that." I felt a lump in my throat. The weight of that week, the terror, the helplessness, the constant fear that I might not hear her voice again, had transformed into something else entirely. Understanding, love, and the realization that survival isn't just about escaping danger. Survival is about carrying forward the lessons learned in fear, about holding on to love when everything else is uncertain. Her parents watched from the kitchen doorway, faces soft, shoulders easing. I realized then that they too were learning what courage really looked like, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act anyway, to protect, to nurture, to love. My granddaughter had shown us all that, with nothing but a voice, a notebook, and an unwavering belief that someone would hear her. The flood had taken much from the town, but it had left something else behind, too. Clarity. People understood what mattered, and they understood how fragile life could be. For me, the greatest lesson was the same one my granddaughter had been trying to communicate all along, that love, deliberate and persistent, can reach across any darkness, survive any rising water, and heal even when the world seems unkind. On quiet evenings, I still replay the old messages. I don't do it to relive fear, but to remember bravery, to honor the child who trusted me with her voice when it mattered most. I tell her story to anyone who will listen, not just to entertain, but to pass along the lesson she taught me, that courage and love are inseparable, and that the choices we make under pressure define more than our survival. They define who we are. And every time I hear her say, "Grandpa, it's me," I feel that same rush of connection, the bond that carried her through the darkness and brought her safely back into the light. That voice, so small yet unwavering, changed everything. It reminded me that even in the most terrifying circumstances, love is always enough to guide us home. Winter came slowly that year, the way it always does in our town. Gray mornings bleeding into gray afternoons, the trees stripped bare, streets glistening with frost. For most people, life had returned to a semblance of normal. For me, and for my granddaughter, the memories of that cellar storm week remained vivid, not as trauma, but as a reminder of resilience. I'd started taking her on walks, small trips around town, just to let her stretch her legs and remind her that the outside world was safe again. She held my hand tightly, but without fear now. There was a confidence in her step, a quiet assurance that comes from surviving something larger than herself. Her notebook had become a kind of diary, filled with sketches and words she insisted on narrating to me. Sometimes it was funny, drawings of the adults slipping on water, floating shelves, a misplaced flashlight. Sometimes it was haunting, stick figures with wide eyes staring at the ceiling, droplets of water drawn as little lines all around. But always there were moments of hope, sunshine breaking through clouds, a boat arriving, hands reaching out. She had transformed terror into narrative, fear into story, and I realized then how vital it was for a child to make sense of chaos in her own way. One afternoon, as we sat together near the fireplace, I asked her why she had insisted on keeping the notebook. Her answer was simple but profound. I wanted to remember who helped me. I asked her who she meant, thinking of the rescuers, her parents, even me. She shook her head. Everyone who listened, even you, Grandpa. You listened when nobody else could. I could hear your love through the phone. I swallowed hard. She was right. That week, my role had been nothing more than listening, holding space for her voice across distance, across water, across terror. And yet, that had been enough. It had reminded me that sometimes the simplest act, truly hearing someone, is the most powerful. It is, perhaps, the first step in saving a life. Her parents joined us later that evening. Her father, who had been distant and tense in the weeks after the flood, now seemed quieter, more reflective. Her mother sat beside her, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. The tension in the room had lifted just enough for small smiles, brief laughter, the normality of shared meals and ordinary conversation. Yet beneath it all, I could see the imprint of what had happened, the argument in the cellar, the decisions, the fear. These were marks that wouldn't fade entirely. They would inform how they all lived, how they all loved for years to come. As the weeks turned into months, I began keeping a journal of my own, recording the messages, the calls, the quiet victories of recovery. Writing helped me process the helplessness I had felt, the hours spent waiting for the phone to buzz, the fear that I might never hear her voice again. I wrote of my relief, my gratitude, and more than anything, the lessons she had taught me, that courage can exist in small bodies, that bravery is not the absence of fear, and that love, expressed, even faintly, even across a broken connection, can traverse darkness and chaos. One morning, my granddaughter and I visited the site of the cellar. The waters had long since receded, leaving behind mud, debris, and the skeletal remnants of what had been a familiar space. I hesitated at the edge of the property, feeling the weight of that week settle over me again. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took my hand and led me closer. "Grandpa, we can't live in the dark anymore," she said softly. "We have to remember, but we can't be scared of what happened." Her words were simple, childlike, yet carried a depth that startled me. I nodded, realizing that she had understood a truth I was still learning. Survival is not just about escaping danger, it's about carrying lessons forward without letting fear dictate life. We walked around the ruins, and she began collecting small objects, a piece of wood, a bent nail, a cracked jar. "These are reminders," she said, "reminders of what we lived through, but also of what we did right." I smiled quietly, marveling at her insight. Even in trauma, children have a remarkable capacity to create meaning. She was transforming remnants of fear into artifacts of courage, proof of endurance. That night, as I tucked her in, she whispered, "Grandpa, when I'm afraid again, I'll think of you listening. That will make me brave." I kissed her forehead gently and held her hand. "And I'll always be listening." It was more than reassurance. It was a promise that no matter what storms came, we could endure them together, because connection, attentiveness, and love had the power to protect in ways we often underestimate. In the months that followed, our small community came together to rebuild. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, helping families restore homes, clear debris, and offer supplies. Stories of survival spread, and my granddaughter's courage became part of the collective memory of the flood. But the true story, the one she had taught me, was quieter. It wasn't about boats or rescues alone. It was about the whispered voice messages, the attention of an elder who refused to give up, the child learning that love and bravery could exist side by side. One evening, while the wind rattled the windows of my house, I played the original voice messages one more time. Her little voice, fragile and unwavering, spoke from beneath the cellar floor, from the edge of fear and uncertainty. Listening, I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt connected, reminded of the power of attentiveness, of love extended across distance, and of the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The storm cellar had been a crucible, shaping lessons in fear, courage, and morality. But the greatest lesson had come from a child who had used her voice to reach someone she trusted, and I had learned in turn that simply listening, holding space, and loving without hesitation can make all the difference. That week underground, with only water and whispers, had transformed us all, not just my granddaughter, but everyone who cared enough to listen, to act, to remain present. Spring arrived slowly, and with it a fragile sense of renewal. The floodwaters had receded completely, leaving behind streets lined with mud and the lingering smell of damp decay. But for my granddaughter and me, spring meant more than recovery. It meant reflection, rebuilding, and reckoning with the weeks that had changed everything. Even small things felt different. The way sunlight bounced off puddles, the way birds returned to branches stripped bare for months, the way ordinary routines carried new significance. She was back in school now, a little quieter than before, but stronger in ways that weren't visible at first glance. Teachers commented on her resilience, on the clarity in her speech, on the way she paid attention to friends who were struggling. It reminded me again how deeply trauma can teach empathy. The cellar had been a crucible, but it had also nurtured a rare understanding in her heart. She knew fear intimately, yet she also knew courage. And courage, I realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. One afternoon, she and I went to the local library to find books about floods, storms, and survival. I wanted her to understand the science, the geography, the facts, but also the human stories, how others had faced disasters and come through them. She thumbed through pages filled with photographs of broken towns, emergency responders wading through water, families clinging to one another. When she paused on a picture of a small child holding a soaked stuffed animal, she looked at me and whispered, "That could have been me." I nodded. "And you survived," I said, "because you were brave and because people listened." She smiled faintly, turning the page carefully as if touching the past might break it. The adults in her life were healing too, though more slowly. Her parents often called me late at night, voice low, discussing decisions made in the cellar, wondering if they could have done better. I listened as much as I could, offering perspective where I had it, reassurance where it was needed, and sometimes silence when words felt inadequate. Those conversations were difficult but necessary. Fear and guilt linger after disaster, and acknowledging them without letting them dominate life is a skill I had learned long ago. I tried to pass it on gently. One evening, a month after school resumed, my granddaughter and I walked down to the river that had caused so much destruction. The banks were muddy, littered with debris, but the water moved calmly, as if unaware of the havoc it had wrought. She stopped at a large stone, placing her notebook on top. "I want to write the story of the cellar, not the scary parts, the brave parts, the things we did right." I nodded, touched by her focus. Children often carry guilt for survival they barely understand, but here she was transforming it into something purposeful, into narrative, into life, into learning. I watched her write for a long time, the pencil moving steadily across the page, the words forming sentences that held her experiences without being weighed down by despair. She drew little illustrations too, hands reaching out, shelves holding children above water, the sun streaming down through imagined cracks. She didn't need to finish the story in one sitting. She didn't need to resolve every question. The act of creation itself was healing. And I realized that perhaps this was the truest form of survival, turning trauma into understanding, turning fear into lessons for the future. Her parents joined us by the river a few days later, tentatively at first, as though unsure if revisiting the flood would reopen wounds. We walked slowly, sharing memories, laughing softly at the absurdities that had occurred amidst fear, and acknowledging the moments that had terrified us. It was strange to find humor in tragedy, but laughter, even quiet, is a balm we often forget to use. We spoke about what had been lost, but also about what had been preserved: trust, connection, courage, and love. The cellar remained a presence in our lives, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of lessons learned. I sometimes thought about the adults who had argued, the difficult decisions they had made, and the moral weight of survival. Life is rarely clean. Choices are often messy, imperfect, and irreversible. And yet, in that imperfect chaos, my granddaughter had discovered clarity. She had learned that being brave does not mean being unafraid, but acting even when fear is present. She had learned that speaking your truth, even in whispers, can change outcomes. And she had learned that love, persistent, patient, unwavering, can traverse darkness and danger in ways that no physical preparation can match. One morning, as I brewed tea in the quiet of my kitchen, I found her sitting at the table, notebook open, pencil in hand. "Grandpa," she said without looking up, "I'm writing a letter to the people who rescued us, to the boat crew." I leaned over, reading the first lines. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for trying. Thank you for bringing us home." I felt a lump in my throat. Those words, simple and direct, carried the weight of the cellar, of 7 days, of fear and courage intertwined. They were gratitude distilled, pure and unguarded. I offered suggestions, but she mostly shook her head. She wanted the words to be hers. The act of giving thanks, I realized, was itself transformative. Survivors rarely think to thank those who acted on their behalf, and yet it is recognition, acknowledgement, that completes the circle of human compassion. She was learning that even small gestures of gratitude can have a profound impact, not just on the receiver, but on the giver, reinforcing courage and reinforcing the bonds that hold families and communities together. As the weeks turned into months, our lives began to normalize in small, meaningful ways. She returned to school, to play dates, to bedtime stories, but the lessons of the storm cellar were never far from her consciousness. Sometimes she would pause mid-story, look at me seriously, and say, "Remember, Grandpa, bravery isn't about not being scared." And I would nod, remembering the small, fragile voice messages, the whispered guidance, and the courage that had carried her through. I understood then that the cellar's darkness would always be part of us, but so would the light we had carried out of it. The voice messages, the whispered instructions, the gentle reassurances, they had formed a chain unbroken that connected fear with love, desperation with action, and survival with moral clarity. She trusted me, and in doing so, she had taught me that sometimes the greatest responsibility of a grandparent is simply to listen, to bear witness, and to respond with love unwavering, even when powerless. And so, as the town slowly healed, as families rebuilt their lives, and as spring warmed the streets and trees, I sat with my granddaughter at my side and marveled at the resilience of her small, determined heart. She had faced darkness, water, and fear, and emerged carrying lessons that would guide her for a lifetime. And in her courage, I had learned something equally profound, that listening, love, and presence are often stronger than the storm itself. By the time summer arrived, the town had begun to feel familiar again, though traces of the flood lingered everywhere. Mud-caked fences, foundations washed away, and streets scarred by rushing water. For most residents, life had returned to its routines, but for my granddaughter and me, the events of that week remained vivid, like a watermark beneath everything. I watched her closely, noticing the subtle ways her resilience showed itself, the steadiness in her gaze, the way she approached challenges with thoughtfulness instead of fear, the compassion she showed for others who were struggling. That child had faced real terror and emerged with a remarkable understanding of what courage and love really meant. One morning, I found her sitting at the porch, notebook open, pencils scattered around her. She looked up at me with serious eyes and said, "Grandpa, I want to make a book about what happened." I hesitated, unsure if revisiting the cellar week in detail would be healthy, but her tone left no room for argument. "It won't just be scary," she promised. "It will be about what we did right, about bravery, about listening." I nodded slowly, realizing that she was ready to process the events in her own way and that creating a narrative might be the best kind of therapy for both of us. For weeks, she worked diligently, scribbling, drawing, and narrating her story to me. Sometimes we laughed, especially at moments when adults had been clumsy or absurd in their panic. Other times, the memories made her pause, the pencil hovering above the page, as if she were trying to capture invisible weight. I watched in awe as she translated fear into words and images, crafting a story that was both honest and hopeful. She had learned something profound, that survival isn't only about enduring the immediate danger, but about making sense of it afterward, learning from it, and sharing those lessons with others. Her parents watched cautiously at first, unsure of how to approach the subject, but over time they joined us. Together, we talked about choices made in the cellar, what had worked, what hadn't, what could have been done differently. There was no blame, only reflection. Her mother admitted that she had sometimes let panic cloud her judgment, and her father spoke quietly about the moments he had feared he might make the wrong decision. I reminded them both that survival is rarely perfect and that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the repaired rooftops, my granddaughter read aloud a passage from her book. The cellar was dark and scary. The water rose. We were afraid, but we listened to each other and we helped each other. Grandpa loved me first, and that gave me courage. Her voice was steady, calm, filled with a quiet authority that belied her age. I realized then that she had internalized the lessons of the flood in a way that would carry her for a lifetime. She had learned about bravery, yes, but also about empathy, communication, and the power of love in moments of fear. The flood had left scars, but it had also left wisdom. I often reflected on the week we had spent in near helplessness, listening to her voice messages and waiting for the world to respond. Those days had been terrifying, but they had revealed truths about human nature, the capacity for panic and selfishness, the potential for courage and compassion, and the importance of listening when someone's life depends on it. My granddaughter's simple act of reaching out sparked a chain reaction that preserved her life, and it taught me something equally profound about responsibility, attention, and care. Over time, she began sharing her story with others, friends, teachers, even small groups at community events. Her narrative was powerful because it was honest, simple, and grounded in human experience. She didn't exaggerate, she didn't dramatize, she simply recounted the events as she had lived them, emphasizing courage, listening, and love. I was amazed at how much impact her story had. People leaned in, listening quietly, sometimes wiping away tears, sometimes holding their children a little tighter. Her voice, once trembling from fear in a dark cellar, now carried authority, compassion, and wisdom beyond her age. Her notebook had evolved into something larger, a blueprint for understanding resilience, a map for navigating fear, and a reminder that the choices we make under pressure define us more than the danger itself. I kept a copy of every page, every sketch, every narrative note. I wanted her story preserved, not as a tale of terror, but as a testament to human endurance and moral clarity in the face of uncertainty. Children learn from the adults around them, but adults also learn from the courage and insight of children who have faced fear head-on. One afternoon, we returned to the river, where I had taken her months before. She held the notebook tightly, as though carrying a treasure. "I want to leave a mark here," she said, crouching down to place a small stone atop a cluster of rocks that the flood had left behind. "This is to remember bravery." I nodded, feeling the full weight of her gesture. She wasn't just memorializing the flood, she was honoring the choices we had made, the lives we had saved, and the lessons we had learned. Her act was a simple, tangible reminder that courage and love could endure even after darkness. That evening, back home, she turned to me and said, "Grandpa, I understand now. I don't have to be afraid to tell someone I need help, and I don't have to wait for someone else to act first." I held her hand and squeezed it gently. "Exactly," I said. "That is bravery, and it will guide you forever." She smiled faintly, closing her notebook, already thinking about the next page, the next story, the next lesson to learn and share. The flood, the cellar, the water, the darkness, it had all happened, and yet it had given her more than it had taken. It had given perspective, clarity, and moral grounding. And for me, it had reaffirmed truths I had long known but had almost forgotten. That listening can save a life, that love expressed consistently matters more than any other form of preparation, and that courage is not defined by size or age, but action in the face of fear. Even now, months later, when storms rumble on distant horizons or rivers swell after heavy rain, I think of that week. I think of the small voice messages, the whispered instructions, the quiet courage of my granddaughter, and I'm reminded that the darkest hours are often the ones that teach the brightest lessons, that the weight of fear can reveal the depth of love, and survival is always more than endurance. It is learning, growing, and passing forward what we have discovered. Summer deepened into late August, and life had begun to feel almost ordinary again. Streets were dry, gardens were planted, and the townspeople moved with a tentative ease, as though testing the stability of a world that had nearly been swept away. My granddaughter thrived in this restored normalcy. She played in the yard, went to school, and even laughed freely. Yet beneath her laughter was the quiet knowledge of what she had survived and what she had learned. Courage had taken root in her soul, and it showed in everything she did. One afternoon, as we sat together under the old oak in my yard, she brought out her notebook again. She had been working diligently, rewriting her story into a sequence she called the Brave Week. "Grandpa," she said, "I want everyone to know what really matters, not just surviving, but how you survive." I leaned over to look, seeing pages filled with illustrations, maps, and short passages, each one capturing a moment of tension, a gesture of care, a small triumph over fear. She had distilled 7 days of terror into a series of lessons that anyone could understand. Kindness matters. Listening matters. Love matters most. Her parents joined us later, and for the first time we had an open conversation about the cellar week, without the fear or guilt that had previously shadowed every discussion. We talked openly about mistakes and fears, about arguments that had seemed so vital in the moment but were trivial in the face of survival. We laughed quietly at some of the absurdities, the way her father had slipped on water while trying to save a shelf, the way her mother had tried to keep everyone calm while secretly panicking herself. And we cried quietly, too, at the depth of what had been endured and the gratitude for lives preserved. It was in those conversations that I fully understood how much growth had occurred in all of us. My granddaughter had learned courage, her parents had learned humility, and I had relearned the profound responsibility of witnessing, a responsibility not just to protect, but to listen, to guide, and to bear witness to the choices others make in desperation. The voice messages she had sent, so shaky and small, had rippled far beyond the dark cellar walls. They had reminded all of us what it means to act with love and attention, even when the stakes are terrifyingly high. Months passed. The flood receded completely from our lives, leaving only memory and reflection. Yet even in this calm, there were lessons to carry forward. One evening, my granddaughter approached me with a small box of keepsakes she had collected, a bent nail from the cellar, a cracked jar, a scrap of wood. "These are important," she said softly, "to remember bravery." I understood immediately. The objects themselves were trivial, but the act of preserving them symbolized understanding, reflection, and the moral weight of experience. They were reminders of fear overcome and love sustained. I helped her arrange the items carefully in a shadow box alongside sketches and notes from her notebook. She stood back, examining it with the seriousness of someone much older than 7, and said, "This is our story, the story of the cellar and how we lived through it." I nodded, feeling the full weight of her words. It was not just survival, it was education, wisdom, and legacy, an inheritance of courage and moral clarity passed quietly from child to grandparent and from parent to child. As the first anniversary of the flood approached, the town held a small ceremony to honor the volunteers, rescuers, and survivors. My granddaughter read a short passage from her book, her voice clear and unwavering. "We were scared, we were wet and cold, but we listened. We helped each other, and love kept us safe." People listened quietly, some holding their children closer, some wiping tears, all hearing the unspoken truth that bravery is not absence of fear, but courage in its presence. I watched her, my heart full, and realized that her story would live long after the waters had receded. That night, back home, I replayed her original voice messages one final time. Her words, so small, so fragile, yet so full of trust and love, echoed through the house. Listening now, I didn't feel the terror I had felt the first day. Instead, I felt awe. Awe at a child's capacity to endure, to teach, to inspire. Awe at the power of a voice, even a tiny, trembling voice, to change the course of events. Awe at the way love can travel across fear, across water, across silence, and find its way to someone who is listening. I thought about the adults in that cellar, the arguments, the mistakes, the fear. I forgave them, not because what they did was perfect, but because survival is never perfect. It is messy, it is human, and it is defined not by flawless execution, but by perseverance, empathy, and the courage to act. And I understood that in the midst of that chaos, my granddaughter had not just survived, she had thrived. She had learned moral courage, she had discovered the strength of her voice, and she had taught me again the value of listening deeply, responding with love, and bearing witness to the lives entrusted to us. Over the years, I have told her story many times to neighbors, friends, and sometimes strangers who ask about the flood. But I always begin with the same truth, that the story is not about water or destruction. It is about listening, love, and bravery. The kind of bravery that comes from speaking when it matters most, from acting when fear would prefer inaction, and from trusting that someone will hear you. That lesson, I realized, is more important than survival itself. It is what shapes the survivor into a person capable of compassion, wisdom, and resilience. And so, as I sit here today, decades older, watching my granddaughter play in a yard that survived its own trial, I remember the voice messages, the darkness, the rising water, and the moments when love reached across fear. I remember how small words, spoken with trust, whispered into a phone, repeated across 7 days, carried immense weight. And I know that the lessons we learn together, born from terror and fear, have become a part of who we are, woven into the fabric of our lives. Sometimes, in quiet evenings when the wind brushes the trees and the sun sets golden across the rooftops, I replay those messages in my mind. I hear her say, "Grandpa, it's me." And I am reminded that courage and love are not defined by age, size, or circumstance. They are defined by action, by attention, and by the willingness to be present when it matters most. That week in the storm cellar, with its darkness, rising water, and whispered fears, left an indelible mark, not just on my granddaughter, but on everyone who loved her. And in that knowledge, I find peace, not because the world is safe, but because love, courage, and attentiveness can illuminate even the darkest moments, and because sometimes the smallest voice can change everything, if only someone is listening.